the first time we ever see some sort of alternative scientific hypothesis on what may be going on inside the Earth is from the astronomer Edmond Halley. This is the guy that's credited with figuring out a way to measure the distances between two planetary bodies, specifically the Earth and the Sun, and also helping Isaac Newton publish the mathematical principles of natural philosophy, which gets into laws of motion, universal gravitation. But what made him a much bigger name was when he was able to predict the exact day and the exact time that a comet was going to pass over the Earth, because he said, based on his observations, this comet had a 76-year orbit around the sun. And he was able to predict that this comet would pass over the Earth again in 1758. And that prediction has been proven right ever since. Every 76 years, this comet consistently passes over the Earth. So because of this successful prediction, they named this comet Halley's Comet. And Halley is also credited with being the first person to create a liquid compass, which ultimately stabilizes the compass needle and makes the compass easier to read. And this was in 1692. And when he started using this compass, he noticed something was off, that the compass readings were like fluctuating like crazy toward the North and the South poles, and pretty much theorized that the only way that these crazy fluctuations could be occurring is if the Earth has multiple magnetic poles. And he determined that in order for that to be the case, that about 4/9 of the Earth would have to be a cavity. So basically about 99.9% of the Earth would have to be hollow. And that this is possibly where the southern lights and the northern lights were coming from the gases released from these atmospheres. And this theory caught on so much that the Royal Society of London actually approved an expedition to go check this out to see if it was scientifically valid. And they actually gave Edmond Halley access to a Royal Navy ship along with an entire naval crew to go investigate this. And they even made him the temporary captain for this expedition. And the ship that they gave him was called the Paramour. And this wasn't just any type of regular ship. This was a naval warship armed with over 6 cannons. And so they set off on this voyage in 1698. So they make it to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, but they do not make it to the poles because the ship they were in couldn't handle the terrain. Because remember, we're talking about the late 1600s, before we had icebreaker ships, which are designed to move through that type of terrain that you're going to see at the poles. So this theory just kind of goes dormant for a while. We don't really hear anything more about it until we also have the Commonwealth Trans-Antarctic Expedition being conducted by the British, which was basically a private expedition sponsored by the Commonwealth of Nations, which was made up of 56 members of the United Nations under the patronage of Queen Elizabeth. And one of the goals was to trek and survey the entire continent of Antarctica and all the surrounding landmass. And as the Commonwealth expedition is going on, the Royal Society of London, which is like a union of the world's most prominent scientists based out of the United Kingdom, they establish a base out there and they name it Halley Research Base after the astronomer Edmond Halley. Now remember, all the way back in the 1600s, Edmond Halley was the first person on an academic level to suggest that the Earth was hollow. And remember, the Royal Society of London gave him a naval warship and made him the temporary captain of that ship and sent him on an expedition to go investigate his theory that the Earth was hollow and open at the poles. And they weren't ever able to determine this because, remember, they made it all the way to the edge of the Atlantic Ocean, but did not make it to the poles because they couldn't get through the terrain, all that ice within the Southern Ocean at that time in 1698. And almost 260 years later, the Royal Society is building a base in his name in Antarctica. Now, mind you, he had a lot of other accomplishments. He was an astronomer royal because of his scientific accomplishments. But it's interesting that they would build a base dedicated to this well-known astronomer who believed the Earth was hollow and potentially open at the poles. That they would specifically build this base in his honor near the South Pole in Antarctica. And it's built by the Royal Society, the same organization that sent him on that original expedition to see if he was actually right, if those openings really were there. And the question is, when they eventually got there 260 years later, did they see that he was right? Because in 2004, the Royal Astronomical Society actually takes measurements